Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Hi, everybody, and welcome in. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are thrilled to have you here. My name is Rachel Seets. I am the Landowner Outreach and Stewardship Manager at Hill Country Alliance. If you haven't already heard of Hill Country Alliance, we are a conservation nonprofit based out of the Hill Country. We work in 17 counties in the area. And our primary mission and focus is to protect and steward what makes our area so unique. That being its land, its pristine streams, night skies, and communities. I'm on the land program at Hill Country Alliance, so a lot of my work revolves around supporting local landowners with their land management goals. So if you're curious about different opportunities, events, guidance, or assistance available to you as a landowner in this area, please reach out to me. I'll be sure to include my contact information in the comments below. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about Hill Country Alliance, I highly recommend checking out our website at hillcountryalliance.org. You can go and read more about our different program areas and what we do here in the Hill Country. Another really great way to stay in touch with what we have going on is to subscribe to our newsletter. You can do this again by visiting hillcountryalliance.org. We include all sorts of local opportunities, events, and updates related to conservation issues and land management in this newsletter. So go and check that out and subscribe. Okay, so today's webinar. This is an introduction to conservation easements. Landowners are frequently asking us what these are, so we are hosting this webinar to provide a high-level look at conservation easements. We have Frank Davis joining us from a land trust called Hill Country Conservancy. He'll be kicking off today's webinar with a presentation all about easements. He'll talk about what easements are, what might drive a landowner to enter an easement or set an easement up on their property, how easements can benefit landowners, and he'll also talk briefly about how to get one started on your own property. Another part of this webinar that we are super excited about, we have a couple local landowners joining us to share their experience in having an easement. These are folks that have already gone through the experience of setting up an easement, and they are here to share their experience with that process and how they feel that it's benefited them since setting one up. So we're excited to hear from them. Okay, so a couple housekeeping items before we get started, and I have copied and pasted these into the chat as well. We do have closed captioning enabled for this webinar. If you'd like to turn them on, simply go to the closed captioning button on the bottom toolbar of your Zoom screen and select Show Captions. Some folks don't have the closed captioning button on the bottom of their Zoom screen, so you can go and press the More button. It'll have 3 dots above it, and then select Captions and then Show Captions. That should set up your closed captionings. And again, I'm going to copy and paste these instructions into the chat. Additionally, to reduce background noise, we ask that you please keep yourselves on mute when not talking. And lastly, we have plenty of time for Q&A, both after Frank's presentation and after our landowner testimonial. So please bring your questions and save them until our Q&A portions. If a question comes up while you're listening to any of the presenters, feel free to add it to the chat. We've got a friendly helper queuing up questions, and they'll keep track of it for when we have a Q&A at the end. That's about it as far as housekeeping. So let's go ahead and get started. I'd love to introduce y'all to our first speaker, Frank Davis. He is the Chief Conservation Officer at Hill Country Conservancy. Frank has managed conservation easement acquisition and stewardship at Hill Country Conservancy since 2005. So he brings a wealth of experience and knowledge to our webinar today. He also has a bachelor's degree in geography from UT and a master's degree in wildlife ecology from Texas State University. So take it away, Frank, and thank you again so much for joining us to share your information.
There we are.
All right.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to start sharing my screen here. Nice to see everybody. Yes, so I work with Hill Country Conservancy, and we are a land trust. If you don't know what that means, you'll learn what that means as I get into the presentation. And much of our focus is on preserving the water, the wonder, and the wildlife of the Texas Hill Country. We have been doing this work for about 20, going on 25 years almost now, and we've accomplished quite a lot, but none of that can be accomplished without the efforts of private landowners. And really the key to our mission is trying to help landowners to keep their land intact and functional for future generations. And we all know that when landowners do that, that benefits all of us. That benefits the public at large. That benefits the water that's coming out of our taps. That benefits the wildlife that we cherish so much. Benefits scenic views. It benefits swimming holes. There's so much that private landowners are doing to keep our land exactly as it should be. And at Hill Country Conservancy, we believe very strongly in finding ways to help landowners to do that. So my presentation today will be really the basics, very high level on conservation easements. I will be talking a little bit through some of the legal items that are part of conservation easements. I'll talk some about the relationship between a landowner and a holder or a land trust in relation to a conservation easement. I'll talk a little bit about how you figure out what a conservation easement is worth, and we'll just kind of take it from there. But before I start, I think it would be really helpful, certainly for me as a presenter, so that I'm not talking into the void, but also I think for everybody here, if we could get a little bit oriented. So I'm going to start with a few questions here. And let's see if my slides advance. Here we go. So here's the first poll question. How familiar are you with conservation easements? And what you'll do here is you'll just, if you're not familiar with using Zoom, you'll just choose the chat function down at the bottom middle part of your screen. Just click that little bubble, and on this one, you'll enter in one of the following, either A, B, C, D, or E. So how familiar are you with conservation easements? Item A says I have a conservation easement on my property. Item B says I am now considering or pursuing a conservation easement on my property. Item C says I have talked with someone or read materials about conservation easements. Item D says I have heard of them, but I am skeptical. And then E, conservation, huh? I've never heard of them until now. That would be very interesting to see how people are responding to this. We have a couple people that are coming in very fresh. That's good to see. One person pursuing or considering a conservation easement. I see, Liz, you're working towards more familiarity. That's great. Appreciate that. Okay, yes. So this is we got some new folks coming in. This is good. Okay, and I know there are a couple people who are being shy that would have entered an A. So Gary Purrier is here, and he'll be one of our landowner testimonials. So Gary, you don't have to be shy with these questions either. So let's move on to the next one. Poll question 2, tell us a little bit about your relationship to the land. So again, on this one, you will choose probably just one option. If you see it's more appropriate to choose 2, that's fine. So I am, or my family is, a longtime owner of 100 acres or more. I realize I'm being arbitrary in acreage here. B, it would be I or my family recently acquired 100 acres or more. C, I own some acreage, but less than 100 acres. D, I advise landowners on caring for their land, i.e. through land stewardship or land management practices. E, I advise landowners on legal, tax, or estate matters relating to their land. And F, I work for a natural resource agency or conservation nonprofit. And certainly if none of those fit, you can enter in other options in the chat box. Okay, we've got some new ones coming in here. Yeah, okay. conservation agencies. Got a smaller acreage landowner, a couple with some larger acreage. Wow, 100 years of land ownership in 2024. That's exciting. Okay, thank you, everybody. Yeah, this is helpful. I hope it's helpful for you. We have two more questions, and these two questions are really directed at those of you who would consider yourself a landowner of some acreage. You choose what the amount might be. But how would you rank the following objectives in relation to your use and enjoyment of the land? So I'm having you reach here and actually ranking from most to least important. So if item A, let's say ranching is your primary objective for your land, you would put down A first and then follow that with any other letters that you think are also important, but maybe not quite to the same extent. So item A, agriculture, livestock production. Item B, wildlife habitat. C, watershed health. D, hunting and or fishing. And E, passive recreation, such as hiking or bird watching, or just scenic enjoyment. So to this one, you'll give several answers in order of most important to least important. Okay. Got some coming in. We got wildlife enthusiast, recreation, watershed health. Okay, I'm seeing a lot on watershed health and wildlife habitat. Passive recreation comes up several times. Okay, we have some agriculture. Okay, this is very helpful. And then we just have one more. And then how would you rank the following concerns in relation to your land? So, in a way, this might be a way of asking what brought you here today. Why are you interested in conservation? But when you look at the landscape around you, what are your greatest concerns? So again, this will be multiple responses. And you'll start with the one that you see as most concerning or most urgent. Sorry, I've just advanced on accident. We'll come back. So the first one would be increased development pressure, fragmentation, and water use around my property. B, future generations, subsequent owners who do not share my values for responsibly protecting the land. And C, economic viability. In other words, I am not confident that we have the resources to keep our land long-term. I see a couple people weighing in on the previous question still. That's totally okay. So on this item, we'll just see 3 responses, maybe just 2. It's okay. So certainly development pressure is a big one here for a lot of folks. Absolutely. Economic viability is coming up too. Nearby development. Okay, yeah. Ranch is going up for sale. Maybe a new highway or highway expansion there. Yes, okay. So I think that some of these topics will resonate with you all based on your responses. I'll go ahead and get right into the presentation. Thank you for taking the time to do that. Nice to see you all here, and thanks for participating. So I think this goes without saying. Gary will recognize this image. This is out in the area out near Bee Cave, Dripping Springs, Hamilton Pool Road, and just west of Austin. And we can see that there's been quite a lot of development on the outskirts of many of these cities and just bleeding out into the hill country. So here we are looking out from a ranch with a conservation easement on it, but looking out towards all of the neighboring development. So kind of immediately in the background there's one development, and I think another development off to the right. And this image is several years old. I'm going to guess that it's more alarming to look at that particular view today. Texas is a state of vast and wide open spaces. It's something that we treasure about our state, certainly. But we are also losing agricultural land and open areas and natural areas at a rate that exceeds any other state in our country. And in just a 20-year period from 1997 to 2017, we lost nearly approximately 2.2 million acres of these lands that are undeveloped, and they've been entirely converted to other uses such as subdivisions and commercial uses and highways and such. And just for context, that's really the size of about 4 counties here in the whole country. So that land has been entirely paved over. It's hard to unpave once you pave it. And then in the just the last 5-year period, we've seen this the rate of development really accelerate. And we've seen that, the equivalent of 2 counties, I would say, about 1.2 million acres has been converted in the last 5 years. This shows a little bit about the extent to which this is happening in different hill country counties. This is from the Natural Infrastructure Plan. If those of you who may be unfamiliar with it, you can just Google Our Texas Hill Country or Natural Infrastructure Plan, Texas Hill Country, and you'll see this come right up. A really compelling report on all of the changes that have been happening. Actually, I'm getting my reports mixed up. So there's the plug for the Texas Hill Country Conservation Network's Natural Infrastructure Plan. But also there's a report called the State of the Hill Country Report, and that's where this is coming from. And you can look that up just the same on the internet. It should pop right up for you. If not, Rachel Seets could send that your way. But long story short, you can see all of the population growth that's happening in these unincorporated areas. So these are areas just outside of city limits where there's really not a lot of land use regulation. And I think this image is a telling one. It really shows how you have these natural areas and then you have the homes and such sort of encroaching into these natural areas. And I don't begrudge anybody for wanting a home, looking out into a scenic view. It's understandable. We all desire things like this. But there is a real question in Texas about how we're planning this growth. And there's the reality that counties do not have any authority to decide where growth occurs, really, beyond some limited restrictions that they can put on that growth. So you can see there's, highly accelerated growth in many places where you might expect, like Travis and Bexar County. But then there's some areas, along the corridor, like Comal County, Hays County and such, and even some areas that are a little more westward that are really seeing some significant growth. And here you can see some charts that show how this growth is occurring also. This is really about the fragmentation and development of rural lands and these natural areas out in the hill country. And this gives a comparison, green being conserved, red areas being developed as of now. And of course, what we would prefer to see over time, particularly in the most sensitive areas of the Texas Hill Country, is that in some ways that conservation keeps pace with development. So we are literally in a race against time to keep these places intact. And again, because about 95% of land is privately owned in Texas, really the key way to do this is by partnering with private landowners. And what is the most robust tool for partnering with a private landowner to limit development and fragmentation? That would be a conservation easement. So here's the introduction for those of you who are totally unfamiliar with conservation easements and said, conservation easement, huh? This is a legal agreement between a landowner and a land trust. And I want to qualify this by saying between a willing landowner and a land trust. Typically, the landowner is always willing. Occasionally, there could be another partner other than a land trust, but no landowner has a conservation easement on their property that they didn't choose to put on their property, or they didn't buy the property with the conservation easement in place and with their knowledge of it being in place. And a critical element here is that a conservation easement protects conservation values, and I will define that in subsequent slides, and limits certain uses of the land, but it does allow for other uses to continue, as you'll see as we carry on here. So what does a conservation easement protect? A conservation easement protects certain conservation values, and this can include rivers and streams, aquifers and springs, in other words, water resources. I heard a lot of folks talking about the importance of preserving water resources. It can preserve working farms and ranches, so different types of agricultural uses. It can preserve scenic vistas even, if you can believe it. There's codified language in the IRS tax code about what a scenic view is comprised of. And it talks about harmonious textures and slopes and hills and waterways and all the things that we know. And they've actually put it into the IRS tax code and describe this. So this is a real thing, and it's important for us to protect scenic views, because we know that as you drive through the hill country, even if you're not driving through the gate of a ranch, you do benefit from seeing these beautiful places along the highway. Also, historical sites are an example of a conservation value, and they're quite common throughout the hill country as well. Why would somebody want to have a conservation easement on their property? Well, they have a keen interest in preserving those conservation values that were described earlier. They have family legacy oftentimes. A lot of folks have, even if they bought their place 10 or 15 years ago, they become very attached to it, and they start thinking about what the future holds for the property and how their kids and grandkids might be involved with it. Or it's been in the land for 100+ years, and they're trying to figure out how to keep the old place together. Key point here, there's a way a conservation easement can be used to unlock the value in the land without having to sell the land outright, which is a very unique concept and a little hard to wrap your head around it, but I'll give a little teaser here. For many folks who live in the hill country, they've seen their land value increase over time. They're getting more knocks on the door, they're getting more paper in the mail, offers and such that indicate that the value of the land is going up. The underlying value of the land has not really gone up. It's not suddenly more productive for ranching purposes. It's not producing bigger bucks for hunting purposes. It's not suddenly more scenic. You didn't suddenly have a new waterway come in that's become the perfect swimming hole that wasn't there previously. And what's happened is that the changes in the landscape around you have caused land values to go up based on speculation, based on development potential. So that's value of your land that's sort of locked in the land. And typically the only way to unlock that value in your land is to sell a portion of it or sell all of it. And a lot of folks do that, and it's an understandable thing to do. But a conservation easement can be a different way to unlock some of that value. And this will become more clear as I go on. And through that unlocking of value, you can reduce estate and income taxes as well. And then occasionally there are cash benefits also. So a conservation easement comes with rights and limitations. So certain rights will continue. Traditional uses, wildlife management, hunting. You might have hunting leases, agriculture. I didn't mention, things that are starting to become traditional but are actually pretty novel would be like Airbnb. There's a lot of different ecotourism options out there that can be perfectly consistent with a conservation easement. Lots of ways to enjoy the property, generate revenue, but without really impacting it negatively in any significant way. And then a conservation easement comes with limitations. So it puts limitations on the amount of subdivision on the property, on the amount of construction. Notice I'm saying limitations. This does not mean an outright prohibition. If you have a particularly large property, you may reserve the right to split it into two pieces. You may reserve the right to build a new home or a couple new homes if the property is large enough to accommodate that. Surface alteration, so outright sort of grading and such. You may need to build some roads, so that involves some grading. That's allowed within a conservation easement, but sort of haphazardly going over the surface of the property and changing it without any real thoughtfulness is not typically part of what a conservation easement allows. Certainly, you'll need to use water for your own residential uses. You may have uses for wildlife or for livestock. That's part of a conservation easement. But selling it to a neighbor, having a big water marketing company come in and drill a well and then pump it somewhere else, that's not usually something a conservation easement would provide for. And I will talk later about vegetation management also. So again, the landowner really, it's important to know that a landowner retains certain rights with a conservation easement. And to me, some of the most fundamental rights of a private landowner involve the ongoing ownership and private enjoyment of your land. You also have the right to give the land to your heirs. I guess you could sell it to your heirs also. You could sell the property to anyone, but it's important to know that once that willing landowner has agreed to put that conservation easement onto their property, now that conservation easement runs with the land. So every future owner now is bound to upholding those values that you put forth in the conservation easement. They're not easily reversed. Thankfully, they're intended to be permanent. So I mentioned vegetation management. So this gets to provisions on agriculture and land management. So primarily a conservation easement, really without exception, is going to limit subdivision and construction and water use and mining, some of those things I mentioned previously. Most conservation easements will have some relationship to the ongoing agricultural use and land management on the property, but they're really based on key values that I think almost any mindful landowner would agree to. So the objectives or the values would be, preserving soil cover, limiting erosion, promoting long-term resilience, productivity, and viability. So these are things that we know are good for the land. If that's our aim, to achieve those objectives, almost any type of management that can achieve those objectives will be good management. And then the management plan that's typically associated with a conservation easement describes specifically how those objectives will be accomplished according to the owner's own approach. And they can be updated and probably should be updated periodically. We're learning as we go. There's new insights, there's new practices. Landowners are learning from each other. Landowners are teaching us how to do things. So the management plan is really kind of a living, breathing document, whereas the conservation easement is sort of, it's permanent, it's recorded, it's goes with the land always. So conservation easement wouldn't be much use unless there was somebody that was a holder of the conservation easement, somebody that was really charged to and entrusted to ensure that the conservation easement is upheld. And I chose this sort of vague image, if you will, because I see a few sort of symbols here that I think are useful. First off, you get a sense of a strand of DNA, and I think so much when we talk about land is driven by ecology. We need to have an ecological understanding of how we're dealing with and treating the land, and I think most everybody here can appreciate that. And then the symbolism of a circle, and even a little bit, you sort of have multiple infinity symbols, just really speaks to me about both the idea of forever, which is a very bold idea that land trusts and conservation easements take on, and just a trust as well. So ideally, that's how you would feel about a land trust if you chose to pursue a conservation easement on your property. That's how you'd feel about your land trust partner, or whomever the holder might be. I should say that holders can also be government agencies, but they don't have to be. So different counties are holding conservation easements. Some cities, like the city of Austin, city of San Antonio, hold conservation easements. But essentially the idea here is a long-term partner to both present and future owners. So they have a shared love for the land. As a private landowner, many of you probably know the feeling of your family members don't quite understand why you care so much about the land, why you think about it, plan so much. They know it's nice, they like to visit, but they're not involved. And a land trust or a holder of a conservation easement can be as involved as you like. And that's really your choice how involved they might be, but they're very keenly interested in caring for your land in the way that you would be. And they come with expertise on ecology, land stewardship, and even some financial incentives to help with land management and land stewardship. So what kind of rights are conveyed to a land trust? Well, the right to monitor the conservation easement. So they would visit with you once a year, typically, and check in. It's a friendly and usually very informal visit. just talking through the conservation easement, making sure that that agreement is being upheld. Ultimately, the right to enforce. And, it's always, I can't help but be a little bit anxious talking about that because we don't really want to be in a position where we're enforcing, but it is something that's important to upholding these agreements long term. Rest assured, any land trust worth its salt is going to be very focused on everything but enforcement, so to speak. They are focused on relationship building and building understanding and communication. But ultimately, that is a right that's conveyed with the conservation easement. And for the purpose of access, this is really limited to those particular needs. Otherwise, it's at a landowner's discretion. So very frequently, there are lots of landowners who welcome us out and invite us out to weigh in on management, to provide new ideas. And maybe they're planning a home site and want to get it just right as far as where it might be. We're happy to come out and be a resource. But if they're not calling on us, really it's once a year. It's the typical amount of visits. So how do you choose a land trust? This is where I get into the really awkward and cliche metaphor of dating, and it goes from there. But there are a few things that you want to look at when you're considering conservation easement. You want to make sure that land trust or the potential holder of the conservation easement is following best practices. And so in the land trust world, an accredited land trust would be a good thing to look for. I'm sure there are very capable land trusts that are not yet accredited, but that's something to look for. That's a third party that audits all of our policies and procedures and records on a regular basis. Look at their long-term capacity. How many conservation easements are they a party to? Does it seem like they have a plan for doing that long-term? Are they in this forever? That's a big thing. And a lot of land trusts will have a restricted fund, what they call a stewardship fund, to do that. So you can ask open questions of a land trust. How many easements are you holding? What's the value of your stewardship fund? Is it restricted to the use, for the use of monitoring and managing these conservation easements? Look at their mission focus, certainly. Does that align with your own mission goals? If your primary focus is on agriculture, you want to hear that resonating when they're talking to you also. If your primary focus is wildlife, water resources, just the same. You want to see that reflected back to you and the people that you're talking with. What's the level of service and support do you feel you're going to get from them? Are they responsive? Are they eager to help? Are they going above and beyond, providing additional resources that maybe you hadn't even thought of? And then, of course, this is where the dated image comes up. What kind of affinity do you have for the people that you're dealing with? Do you feel like you can get along with these people and that they understand you and that you're able to communicate well? Once you do agree on a land trust and you start working through the basics of a conservation easement, I would call that the dating phase. So at this point, you're thinking, okay, we have some basic agreement on what we want to do here. We like each other. There's some work that needs to be done for us to figure out whether this is a really good pairing. And so, let's figure out, okay, I have a big ranch. I want to put 3 homes on the property and be able to divide it twice. Is that something they're comfortable with? Is that something that the land trust feels the land can accommodate? Or do we need to talk through that? So you have some time to work through the details of what would go into a conservation easement. Nobody's particularly bound during that phase to continue. It's really an exploration phase. So I think that the dating analogy suits things well here. But then once you do have a conservation easement on your property, again, I hope nobody's getting married here without wanting to be married. But you have the opportunity to work through all that. And eventually you say, this makes a lot of sense. And oftentimes it's a, happy handshake or even a little celebration like the one in this picture. We've done it. And that's a marriage with no prospect for divorce. So the idea is that once the conservation easement is set up, that's a commitment that's been made long-term and forever. There's now an extended family looking after that child, which is the land. And like the land is resilient. but also sensitive. So think of a land trust as this stakeholder that has a little more insight into how land is conditioned, the traumas that have been experienced by the land in the past, and then that unique environment. And just think of that, that's where a land trust comes in, is to help provide those sort of professional insights on how you can better care for your land, if you will. So traumas, erosion, overgrazing, excessive clearing. Oh, look, I put erosion twice. Apparently that's an important one. Challenging environment. Anybody who's been in the hill country for any period of time, unless you popped in for just a few months of really rainy months, otherwise we know that it's semi-arid with unreliable rainfall. So it can often seem like a desert here. So really we should be planning and conducting our management as if it is a desert, and just be grateful when it does rain, rather than planning like it's a rainy place and wishing it would rain. So a different approach to how we manage our land. We know that watershed health is declining, aquifer levels are declining. That's affecting wells and swimming holes and springs and such. And then surrounding land uses also put strains on each of these properties. So again, in raising the baby, we have to be mindful of all of these different circumstances. So this gets to a little bit on the financial benefits. I mentioned the idea of unlocking the value of the land earlier, and contribution of a conservation easement can entitle the landowner to tax benefits. There's various types of tax benefits, including both estate tax benefits and income tax benefits, and in some cases, cash payment. I don't want to oversell that last point, but that is sometimes an opportunity. Well, okay, so there's some financial benefits associated with a conservation easement. How is that determined exactly? And I'm going to spend a few moments on this question because it is rather nuanced and one that gets confusing quickly. So bear with me, and I apologize if there's still questions remaining. At the end of my presentation, we can certainly come back to this particular question. So development potential is the key item to consider here. If you live far out in West Texas and you haven't seen anybody for days because you're on 100,000 acres and you're out in the middle of nowhere, there's not a lot of development potential. On the other end of the spectrum, if you live just outside of San Antonio, or just outside of Austin, Texas, or just outside of Bernie, or just outside of downtown Kerrville, there's a lot of development potential. And so there's sort of a relative amount of development potential associated with your land. And this strange image, to me, makes a lot of sense. It's somebody coming from outside and saying, I want to take a slice of what you have, and I want to benefit from it, and then I'll pay you for what I'm taking. And in this case, they're taking that development potential. They're taking your land, and they're saying, you know what, we're going to take this right associated with your land, which is to develop it. We're going to use it. We're going to make profit off of it. And because of that prospect, we're willing to pay you more for your land. This is what's happening out in so much of the hill country. The reality is most of us don't want to give a slice of our pie away to some outside influence. We want to keep it with the pie so that we can enjoy it intact, if you will. So you really have these kind of two diverging options. One is to do nothing, which is a perfectly acceptable option for many reasons. But what's often happening is people feel like they're being forced into a choice. And so one choice to sell is to sell all or part of the land. That's how you unlock some of that value. And then the second choice is through a conservation easement. So the value of a conservation easement, again, depends on the development threat associated with the property. In other words, look around at neighboring properties, look around at local highway infrastructure. What's happening? Are changes happening quickly? That drives up development potential. But then you have to look at the particulars of a property and questions about road access. Is it fronting a public road? Is access by way only of a private easement? Is there sufficient water availability? Are there pipelines coming in from LCRA or some other utility that are providing water, or is there, really good groundwater and you've had it tested? There's a lot of things that affect development potential. And of course, the size of a property. So small properties do not have a lot of development potential, but if you have several hundred acres, that's more likely that some developer might want to purchase that for the sake of putting a lot of homes on it. And this is based on a percentage of the land value. So again, this image that shows the proportions, if you will, makes a lot of sense here. This is determined by what they call a qualified appraiser. So there are appraisers who are trained specifically on conservation easements. And they kind of look at what you're giving up by putting a conservation easement on your property. Basically, what you're doing is you're saying no thank you to a lot of speculation, to a lot of other types of buyers. The only buyers that you're welcoming once you have a conservation easement on your property, if you were to sell it, would be those that want it intact, that want to run it as a ranch, that want to run it for hunting, that want to run it for scenic enjoyment, that just want to enjoy the place and watch birds. Those are now your pool of buyers. And that does bring down potentially the price on the property. That's where that percentage of land value associated with a conservation easement arises. Some folks will say, okay, so Frank, I've heard it's 50%. So it's 50%. I think my land's worth $5 million. And so a conservation easement must be worth 2.5 million. It's really not that simple. But if you're looking for some range of percentages, I think you can assume somewhere in the range of 35 to 55%. You can see I'm being cautious there for the sake of not giving any false expectations to anybody. So now you've said no thank you to the developer, and you're really trying to figure out, okay, what is my conservation easement worth? So this is the amount that the land would sell for. I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead. The fee value is an important concept to understand. The fee value is a term that's often used in real estate. So this is prior to a conservation easement. You just say, I'm done here. I'm out of choices. I'm going to sell this land outright. Let's just see what people bring. Let's assume you're on a piece of land that could accommodate 50 lots. It's a rather large tract of land. Let's assume it's worth $5 million. Today's real estate, maybe it's worth a good bit more, but let's say 5 million for this example. And again, the development potential on the property is significant. It's a large tract of land. Arguably, somebody could put as many as 50 lots and homes on their property. In that case, I might estimate just academically that 40% of that fee value is associated with the conservation easement. So by virtue of saying, we're not going to develop this property, we're not going to chop it up into lots, we're going to put an agreement in place that runs with the land that says it will not be developed in that way. You've now reduced the value of your property by approximately 40%, according to an appraisal. So that means that what was a $5 million property, because it had this hypothetical value caught up in it, is now a $3 million property once you put a conservation easement on it. That makes the value of the conservation easement $2 million. So the question is, what do you do with that value? How might you benefit? So there's a few things here. I'm leading with the point that probably is least relevant to the most people. It can help with estate planning. So for those with really significant tracts of land and some other assets, it can sometimes be helpful to reduce the value of an estate through a conservation easement. I can think of one example where the land was worth $20 million and they put a conservation easement on the property and it reduced the value of the property by more than half. And that meant that they were no longer subject to estate taxes. So that's a rare instance. I'm not going to say too much about that. There are also income tax incentives. So when you put a conservation easement on your property, if you donate that value in that hypothetical scenario I made up, if you donate $2 million of value by virtue of a conservation easement, that's much like making a $2 million cash gift. Not exactly, I want to be really clear, but a lot like it. In many ways, this is like making a gift to a nonprofit. So it's an in-kind donation, and there are income tax benefits associated with that. And then again, in rare cases, there might be some grants available. So this is for especially sensitive or unique lands. lands that are especially prone to development. Usually you would need to have the land assessed by a land trust to see if they think it's especially high value and would rank well. There's limited money out there and it can be very competitive. Typically, that pays a portion of that value. Just hypothetically, in the situation where you have a conservation easement worth $2 million, there's some situations where somebody can receive, say, $1 million in cash, and then they donate the remaining $1 million in kind for tax benefits. Again, I know there's a lot there on value, and imagine a few of you have your heads spinning, so I apologize. So now you've decided to put a conservation easement on your property, and what happens next? Are the black helicopters suddenly flying over? Are the land trust patrolling outside your gate suddenly? No, that's not quite how it goes. We're busy people and we don't want to do that. And I don't have a helicopter. So, but there is an annual review and a visit. And so again, we have a questionnaire that we go through that prompts good questions. It might ask, okay, so, Mr. Jones, you've got the right to another home on your property, according to this conservation easement. At our last visit, you mentioned you might want to start building that. Do you want us to help you, confirm that it's in the appropriate location? Is there anything we can help with your planning? Maybe a landowner says, it's time for us to put new roads in. And ironically, we've learned a good bit about road construction and how to do it in the least impactful way. And so we can give some guidance on that. So these visits are really about a partnership. If you do plan to do something substantial on your property and you've reserved the right to do that, such as building a home, there will be some plans that go back and forth. So, this is a great opportunity to provide notice to a land trust. We always just say, if you're not sure, pick up the phone, just let us know what you're planning on, and we'll tell you if we need to go through any formalities there. We do want to provide as much guidance and support as we can. We're usually doing that. Wish we had more capacity, frankly, where we can always be reaching out and checking in. But oftentimes it's folks reaching out to us, or they get a newsletter from us and they're interested in something that we're doing. And that's where we can provide some additional support. And it really is a partnership. I mean, that is the aim. The aim is to just join hands with that landowner and to continue to help in any way we can to keep the land really functional and beautiful and intact. I think that covers it for me. So just under my time. Hopefully that didn't go on too long. This is my contact information. I can put it in the chat also, and I assume you'll get it in other ways as well. But thanks you all.
Thanks, Frank. Does anybody have any questions for Frank? We've got time for a brief Q&A. You can raise your hand or just unmute and ask.
Frank, I'm going to jump in here real quick, man. You were talking about, large acreage properties where they were valued, I guess, a 50% conservation value. What if hypothetically you're in an area like I am, obviously Kendall County, where you have full-on housing developments going on that are quarter-acre lots? What kind of development value? What kind of conservation value can be ascribed to that?
You're saying what would be the percentage? So I gave a 35 to 55% sort of rough range. Well, it when you're right in the middle of really small lot development, the values go upwards as far as proportion goes. So if you look at that $5 million property that I mentioned, in that case, your conservation easement could be worth as much as $4 million of that. Now that's an extreme scenario, but it can happen.
Okay, thank you.
Thinking maybe we should go with folks. If folks want to raise their hand, and then I'll try to look at the chat as well. But
I have a question. Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
I have a conservation easement just south of my sister's ranch. We're on the same watershed, very major watershed. And she's considering getting a conservation easement on her ranch because of my pushing. Question I have on my ranch, which would also affect hers. What if someday in the future our kids sell the ranches or sell the ranch and the new buyer abuses the conservation easement, what are the consequences for them? How does the conservation easement get protected from people who abuse it or might abuse it or whatever? Do they have to pay back the money that we were given for the conservation easement, which in some cases they'd be willing to do because it would make so much money doing it? Or what are the consequences of abuse of our conservation easement when we have it? I have one now. She's going to get one.
That's a great question. Yeah. So there's a real question of whether folks are going to exploit this or abuse this in some way. And that's an important concern. So the enforcement rights that come with the conservation easement do give a land trust some significant authority in being able to address that. A lot of land trusts, we maintain a restricted fund that's specifically for that purpose. Ideally, 99% of our visits with landowners are amenable and cooperative, but occasionally there will be folks who have conservation easements on their property, typically folks who purchased it with the conservation easement in place or perhaps had it passed down from prior generations. And those folks very well might desire to abuse the conservation easement, and that's where those enforcement rights do come in. And these things are holding up in court, I should say. There's not, thankfully, a lot of arbitrary case law. I'm going to sound like an attorney. I'm not an attorney, but I talk with some about these things, and there's not a lot of cases where folks are coming in and just abusing conservation easements and getting away with it, because thankfully the contract's very clear on what can and can't happen. I hope that's helpful.
So they can't, like say someday 2 generations or 3 generations down, developers just start developing it and have to pay back the money that we got. That's all they have to do, and they can go about ripping it up.
Well, if they start to subdivide it in any way, then that's already contrary to the contract, so that's illegal in and of itself. And then furthermore, ideally anybody should be talking with their land trust and asking them this particular question. I can only answer for the case of Hill Country Conservancy, and I would say that we are, we're equipped to deal with that through our practices. We're going to catch these things before they get too far along. But also we have, we have the capacity to enforce these things effectively.
Your yearly monitoring would help flag it so that the Conservancy would be aware that development has started.
That's right.
Frank Azalea asked a question in the chat.
Thank you. Yeah. So is there a minimum of acres you have to own to have a conservation easement? The short answer is no. We can always come up with some arbitrary number, but the real question as far as whether a property is large enough relates to what's on the property and what's it's surrounded by. So let's say you're on a 10-acre tract of land that's surrounded on 3 sides by conservation areas. Well, there might be some real important reason to have it under a conservation easement. It's really a question for a land trust because they are taking on a long-term responsibility in holding that conservation easement. You might also be on a property that is sort of isolated, but especially unique. Maybe it has a bat cave on the property. There's another example of where a relatively small property could be viable for a conservation easement. But the short answer would be that typically, when a land trust is looking at a conservation easement, they're thinking in terms of landscape scale. So we have a vision among Hill Country Conservancy, Hill Country Alliance, many of the partners in the Texas Hill Country Conservation Network of preserving another 550,000 acres in the coming years. So we can't really do that in 5 and 10 acre chunks very capably. So you can see that we're going to be focused on larger acreage typically. Michelle asks, can you talk about any cost consideration to the landowners? In other words, the cost of valuation or due diligence costs ahead of an easement? Great question. So every conservation easement is a real estate transaction. So it does incur some expenses for everybody involved. That's typically negotiated individually with the land trust and the landowner. I think there's a few things that tend to hold true. And that's that there needs to be a current survey of the property, certainly to put the conservation easement on there. And typically a landowner will cover that expense. The land trust might cover some of the other expenses like their own due diligence and creating a baseline report. It's sort of an expansive documentation of everything on the property that's man-made and natural. Those are things that the land trust usually happily takes on. And then there's some additional work that needs to be worked out with the land trust. It is important to say, I wouldn't want anybody to be surprised that any land trust is going to ask for a landowner to support their long-term administration of the conservation easement. It is a real expense to go out and check in on these things on a regular basis. And then worst case, as was mentioned earlier, to have to enforce them. So a lot of landowners will make a gift to the land trust when they set up their conservation easement. It's like an endowment for the baby, if you will. Sorry, I'm not being too specific there, Michelle, but that's something to talk through with the land trust. Ben asks, if your property is in Kendall County, you might consider seeking due diligence or, oh, thank you. That's some good guidance. Yes, so there's some opportunities there in Kendall County. And yes, there's also other ways that land trusts might seek to raise money for the landowner's expenses in that regard. I should say that particularly when a landowner is donating their conservation easement, I think, especially if it's an important property, a land trust is going to be eager to try to figure out how to make that financially feasible for the landowner. Did you want to say anything else, Ms. Moore? You maybe we covered it already.
Well, it didn't cover all of it for me, but
Okay.
because it could be multiple generations down the way. And I was told way back somewhere when I got my conservation easement that all the developer has to do is write a check for the money that we were given for our conservation easement, and they could rip it up. So I'll
Absolutely
ask,
not. Yeah.
your answer was to ask the trust company whenever we get the trust, whenever we get that going, and I'll ask them that question. Thank you so much for helping me with that. And for a side note, if I might please tell you that I'm jealous of the beautiful view out of your window. Gorgeous, pretty place.
Yeah, I get out here every chance I can. Yeah, I mean, the good news is that people aren't just paying off people to get out of conservation easements. They're not designed that way, and that would be, grounds for a land trust losing their credited status. The only way a conservation easement can be overturned in any way where folks can just, work willy-nilly against it is what they call a state court of competent jurisdiction. If that sounds formal, it is. So the idea is that the attorney general would have to be presented a case by both the land trust who holds the conservation easement and the landowner that the conservation easement no longer has a valid purpose. And certainly the land trust wouldn't be making a bunch of money from this scenario. So this happens very, very rarely. And then I didn't get to condemnation. I hate to say it, but condemnation is an important issue. And so this is where utility lines and such are coming into the region, and conservation easements are not a foolproof way to stop that. So there's a scarier example potentially of something that can happen in spite of a conservation easement.
I will say that I know somebody who works for a pipeline company. He says they try to steer clear of conservation easements that have federal dollars tied to them, like the RC, NRCS or CPP funding. But obviously it wouldn't stop, say, TechStop from using eminent domain and some other entities from using it.
Yeah.
Just FYI, he was explicit. He said, don't ever use that against me. It's out there.
Well, I see at least one more question, Rachel. I want to be mindful of time too. How are we doing?
We're okay. We can go for one more question.
Okay, so Colin asks, how many months or years does the process typically take? I like that you included years in there, Colin, because that's the right attitude. It is not fast, and there's different levels of complexity associated with conservation easements, but I think it's important. There's a few reasons that it takes longer than probably it should, at least conceptually. First off, it's a decision that's being made that's permanent, and it's about what for many people is their most valuable asset. So you're thinking through all these complex questions you've never had to tackle before. Well, gosh, I don't know if we ever would build another home for, I don't know. My son's 10 years old. What's he going to want in 15, 20 years? I don't know, so you're you're starting to wrestle with these questions for the first time, and you're getting new insights from a land trust about all the incredible things on your property that you haven't seen before, and all these incredible things that are, worth valuing and protecting. So there's just a very steep learning curve early on, and you're making really consequential decisions. So these things take time. And that's just on the landowner side. And then there's the reality of people have other lives that carry on, and vacations and kids to attend to and all of those things. But on the land trust side, it really depends on what a landowner is trying to achieve. If the landowner says, look, I'm eager to make this happen, I'm doing this for tax purposes, I've got to make this happen by end of year, let's just get it done, it can happen in a few months. We're working one project right now. We'll close that within a 3-month time period. It's exactly like that. In other cases, when the landowner says, look, there's a lot of value here, I think my place is especially spectacular, I'd like to be paid some cash for this. That involves us going out and applying for grants and waiting to hear back, and then waiting for the grant agreement, and then dealing with, whoever it is that's funding the easement and their own particular requirements. So that can take quite a long time, on the order of a couple years, or even in some cases 3 years from the genesis of the idea. So it's good to, I would say, if this is something that you're interested in, you don't have to commit yourself, but just make the interest known sooner rather than later, so that land trust or the land trust that you talk to is aware of your interest, and they can start thinking ahead about how to plan for it. I think that's always very good advice. Azalea says, can you real quick explain what a stewardship fund is? Yeah, so this is the restricted fund that a land trust puts in place, often funded by landowners when they set up their conservation easement. So this is like an endowment is sometimes the term that's used, but the idea is that you put money into an account, and the interest on the account is what pays for those expenses long term. And that way, that the corpus remains there long term. So a lot of land trusts, our business model, if you will, is that we build our stewardship fund over time. As we take on more conservation easements, we're taking on more financial burden to go out and check on things and enforce potentially long term. But as we take on that burden, we're building up a corpus of a fund that spins off interest that allows us to pay those expenses on a regular basis. Really important component of being a land trust. This is how we make that very bold and audacious promise of forever. And last question, I should let Rachel get to it. Are tax incentives one time or overtime? I'll put a link in there on tax incentives. How about that? Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, Frank. I will be sure to share Frank's contact information along with the PowerPoint that he shared today with you guys in a follow-up email tomorrow, so that y'all can review as needed. All right, I'm gonna unpin Frank. So for this next portion, we have a couple Hill Country landowners joining us today. We have Gary Purrier and Jennifer Carloy. Jenny and Gary for joining us today. We're so excited to see you and to hear from y'all.
Good morning.
So as far as our first questions, of course, I would just love to briefly hear some introductions from each of y'all. What's your background in land ownership? How'd you get to the Hill Country, and where are you from?
Well, my name's Gary Purrier. I'm from Austin, Texas, born and raised, 5th generation. The ranch we live on was actually homesteaded in 1880. So we've had it a while. And we decided about 5 years ago, when we got it into the conservation, and 3 years before that, I was one of the landowners that took 3 years to get one done, with Frank's patience, that we were able to pull it off and get it done. And we were very excited about it. So it was a challenge, but we got it done.
Thanks, Gary. Jennifer?
Well, my name's Jennifer Carloy, and I am the owner, along with our family. We own Inspiring Oaks Ranch, which is just outside of Wimberley, between Wimberley and Blanco. And we bought the place in 1999 and have been just very fortunate as landowners for I guess it's been over 20 years, but really the purpose of buying the property in the first place was to find a way to conserve it. So I'm very excited to be part of this webinar, which means that we're participating in a community that we really believe in.
Thanks, Jennifer. So as far as first questions, yeah, we kind of wanted to know how you first heard about conservation easements and what ultimately led you to decide to set one up on your property. So it's kind of a twofer.
Well, for us, our ranch is across the road from the Shield Ranch, which is a large conservation ranch in Austin area. That's where I first heard about conservation easements and ranches. And then probably my dad passed away in 2006, and we were actually going to sell the ranch. We actually were going to, it was one of those things where I was the one taking care of it. My mom had remarried and moved to Austin, and it became just another thing to take care of. And we actually had it up for sale, and it actually sold. And then it didn't go through in 2008. And I decided out of, I guess, seller's remorse that we would never put it up for sale again. So then I was introduced by a friend of mine about conservation easements, which I knew nothing about except for the ranch across the road from me. And we started exploring it, and that's when I met Frank. And the process started of a conversation, and I learned all about how it works and preserving the land. And because we've had it for so long, it's one of those things you can't ever get rid of. You've got to hold on to it, give it to your kids, and they give it to the next group, as another lady spoke about earlier. And so for us, owning it now 143 years in one family, held by my great-great-grandfather who actually homesteaded it, I made it a mission to preserve it. And so that's what we're doing.
Thanks, Gary.
So we got interested, I guess from the get-go, we were interested in preserving the ranch. I think the idea of land ownership and preservation really, in a way, kind of came from my upbringing. We, of course, obviously didn't own the ranch for over 100 years, but I spent my childhood camping and really enjoying the beauty of nature, seeing how my place and, kind of learning about my place in the world, not just part of a city, but part of a greater world around me. My mom grew up on a farm and has great memories of going up on a rock and looking over the landscape and enjoying the trees and finding a place of peace. And then unfortunately for their family, when her father died, they did sell the ranch. And what happened after that is that over the course of many years, all of my mom and her siblings, they kept wanting to go back to that farm that they grew up on and bring their children. And I think kind of the story of regret of losing the ranch, I think, is part of what gives me the idea of maybe a generational ranch is something that has value. And the appreciation of camping and being out in nature, the value that brings to me and to just anybody that gets to go out hiking and enjoy what's already there, that we don't have to create, that's already created for us to enjoy. Those are the two kind of propelling reasons to conserve the ranch with a conservation easement.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. As far as other questions, a big question that we had was, what kind of benefits have y'all seen now that you have an easement on your property? I know Frank kind of mentioned some of the valuation benefits and tax benefits, but what have y'all seen personally since you since you started this process?
Well, I
for
guess
us,
for me, the biggest benefit has been the partnership. And that's something that Frank has mentioned, and he's put it in the context of it being a very beneficial experience. And that is exactly how I've experienced it, is that in the process of putting the conservation easement on the property, doing the baseline report, I learned so much about the property. I was gratified to hear, oh, there's a lot of native grasses here. And I really wasn't aware of all the names of everything. So just being around professionals, people enthusiastic about conservation, and people that are knowledgeable that I can learn from, I think that has been just very gratifying. It's a deeper partnership with your own ranch, I guess, if you when you get to know it in a deeper way. In addition to that, the baseline provided us partnerships with some people that have gotten involved with caving, and we have opened our ranch up to some Montessori middle school students who ended up discovering, with the help of the baseline report, saying, well, here's where we think a cave might be. Well, these middle school students had an opportunity to actually dig it out and make a sense of discovery. And their teacher was telling me, well, maybe these are future geologists and people that have a new career path. Who knows what people will do, but it is really, the partnerships are amongst me, our family, and the land trust, but then it reaches out beyond into the other professionals, and then just other people that have some way or interest to benefit from getting involved with the land trust.
Thanks, Jennifer. That's so neat about the middle school students.
It's exciting. You're right.
Yeah, that is so neat. Gary, what benefits have you seen from having an easement on your property?
Well, our benefits, part of it was tax purposes for us, and dealing with property taxes with Travis County. It made a difference putting it into a conservation easement, because there's structures on it where before, if it wouldn't have been in a conservation easement, there would have been higher taxes to be paid on some of the structures that are on it than if it is in a, because we argue the point with Travis County that it is in a conservation easement. You actually have to sometimes go see them and sit in front of them to get that across to them that it is in a conservation easement. So there's not that tax value there, because there's a house that's in it. The ranch house, our ranch house, is in the conservation easement, and it was a separate 1 acre tract of land, or 1 acre tract of land with a house on it that had tripled in value because the home was not a homestead anymore. It was actually just a ranch house. Well, the property tax value on it like tripled in like 2 years. And so you had to go back and argue the point of it. You can't sell it, so it's not worth as much. And so they were willing to work with us on that. And then there's the land where Rachel comes out and helps me see things that I'm doing wrong or right that I need to correct. And so, but it gives you, I learn a lot from her when she comes to visit with me, just what we actually own that you really don't think about until I actually start to have it brought to your attention, what the land stewardship is, because we run ours as a ranch. And so what the actual value of that property is and the views that are around it.
Thanks. So yeah, we've got a couple different perspectives where we have Jennifer is talking about the perpetuity of the land and the benefit that she's receiving from protecting this land. And then Gary also, is getting that benefit and the tax benefits from an easement. So there's a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different reasons for entering an easement. I know we kind of touched on this with the benefits, but what's life like with an easement in place? Frank joked about helicopters, What's changed? What have y'all noticed has changed? Are there anything that's better, anything that's worse?
Well, in the beginning, for us, it's one of those things. Whenever we entered the agreement, you still think, at least I did, you still think that you run it like you did before, and there are then the do's and the don'ts that you're supposed to do and not do. And so, but what you learn to do over a period of time is nurture it like a child and watch it grow, and realize that if you don't do these things, all you're going to do is you're going to have a photo of it and then it doesn't exist anymore. So you want to try and hang on to that for as long as you can.
Thanks, Gary. Jennifer?
Well, basically, we had a similar experience, and there's nothing wrong with having somebody hold you to your values. You know, it is sometimes you can start fantasizing, oh, I could put a little cabin here, or I could do this or that, and it is, you know, when you love the land and you're excited about it, and then you start thinking about ways to develop it, Rachel or whoever you're working with in the land trust can say, hey, that's not the point. Remember, you were conserving this place. And, you know, in the long run, that is exactly what we want to do. So just having a partner that is enthusiastic, but also legally binding to ensure that you are living up to your own values. There is actually a benefit to that.
Thanks, Jennifer. So my last question, and an important question, especially for landowners considering entering an easement, is what advice would you give to a landowner considering entering an easement? Jennifer, we can start with you.
Well, it does take a while, and it is time well spent. So not being in a rush, I think in the long term is a good approach. Engaging your family can be a benefit because especially the next generation, if they're old enough to be engaged, they are if they are the next owners of the property, they'll be you need to have them at least involved with the idea of the point of the conservation easement. And I think the idea of trying to plan for in perpetuity, that does take time. And I think it's a very valuable time well spent. So I really, it's very meaningful to think about these questions, and but I would allow yourselves to go through the whole process of thinking things through.
Thanks, Jennifer. Gary, thoughts?
Well, for our family, I have 4 daughters who probably you never can get all 4 daughters to ever get along. So we and my sister never had children. So the way our family trust is set up, my 4 daughters would inherit the ranch. So the choices were either sell it and divide the money or preserve it. So I chose to preserve it, and they didn't have a choice in the matter. And figuring that's the way to protect the land for long term. So whether they sell it to the next person that wants to own everything that we put in our conservation easement, which is how it was designed, or they decide they want to keep it. I know I did one thing. I kept the land intact, which is what my father would have wanted. So that was very important for me.
Great, thanks. Any other little tidbits, pieces of advice I might add?
Just enjoy your land if you own it. Either way, whether you put in a conservation or not, take care of it.
I would agree with that.
That's a great final note there. Well, Gary and Jennifer, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us and give us your perspective. This is a great time, great opportunity for folks in the audience to type questions into the chat for Jennifer and Gary. We've got 2 landowners here that have gone through the experience of having an easement. So definitely take advantage of this opportunity and ask some questions. Feel free to unmute yourselves or pop them into the chat.
I'll ask one. I'll ask an inflammatory question of Gary and Jenny. So you said a lot of great things about conservation easements. What's the hardest thing?
The hardest thing, wanting to do more, but not having enough time.
I can't help that. Yeah.
No, I know.
I know that feeling.
It's been one of our best decisions we've ever made as a family.
It's great to hear. Yeah.
We can't hear you, Jennifer.
There. So yeah, it is a difficult question. I don't really think of it as hard. I really just see all the benefits. I guess the hardest thing about having an easement at the end of the day is just being really able to remember little details about what you can and can't do. But like Frank said, if there's a question, just pick up the phone and ask. So
Thanks. Daniel, so you have your hand raised.
Yeah, Gary and Jennifer, thank y'all so much for joining this session and sharing your experience. If you could go back in time to the starting line of this process of going through the conservation easement, is there anything you would have done differently with hindsight as far as how you approached and went through that process?
I don't have any. I think what we did was exactly right. I don't have any regrets about any of it.
yeah, I guess I have a similar answer. I don't have any regrets, and I feel like because we did take time, we took about 2 years, just a little over 2 years, and we did have a situation right before we closed where a pipeline did want to go across our property, and although we didn't prevent it from going across it, we did move it so that it didn't go through our property. And that, even though the conservation easement didn't prevent it, it was a good negotiating tool, and it did deter them. So when you think of regrets, it's difficult to think of a regret when you've had so many great benefits.
I think that speaks back to the dating metaphor that Frank had. There's both these landowners are very happy with their easements, and I think a big part of that is finding the right land trust partner, the right partner to carry that easement and partner with you on that.
Well said. I agree.
All righty. Well, should any questions come up, any thoughts, concerns about conservation easements, please don't be a stranger. We would love to hear from you. I'll be following up tomorrow with an email that'll contain a recording of today's session. It'll contain Frank's PowerPoint along with his contact information, and his colleague Rachel Lindsay, who has kindly been helping out in the chat with keeping track of questions. Thank you, Rachel, for that. And yeah, again, don't be strangers. Please reach out if you have questions. Frank and Rachel are amazing resources. Jennifer and Gary, thank you so much for joining us today and giving us some of your time. It's so nice to hear from actual landowners that have been through this experience. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah,
All right.
it's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's it. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your week, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future.
Thanks, everyone.
See y'all.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.